All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Education Insider Short. I'm here with one of my good friends and fellow attendee of the Tech and Learning Ed Exec Summit that took place a few weeks ago, Collin Earnst. I'm super pumped to be here with him. We're going to share just a little bit of information about what we thought of the show and some takeaways for all of you that weren't there, but also dive into some of the really critical things that Collin covered in his session, specific to various growth stages of companies and what they can do to manage that change and grow with it. So Collin, if you could give the listeners an intro, get a little background, and maybe share a few of your high-level takeaways. What'd you think of the conference?
Yeah, Jacob, great to see you. So I've been in this EdTech space for 20 plus years, most of that in high growth organizations and helping them scale and build great teams, great processes, great leaders. And that's been kind of my driving passion throughout my time. And it was great to be able to get back with similarly minded folks at the Ed Exec Summit. You and I were chatting earlier about events like EdNet and SIIA and even the ASU GSV conferences that have endured a little bit differently. This was kind of a really nice mix of all of those. I thought it was, a really manageable size where you could actually spend quality time with folks and great opportunities to do so, and then dig in with a handful of great sessions. So this was just such a breath of fresh air and a beautiful setting, by the way, where they hosted. Didn't you think?
I did, and I didn't take advantage of any of the wine tours. I don't drink much these days, and so I'm a little worried about having a couple glasses of wine during the day. Like I'd have to go probably take a nap. And
right.
Being a closet introvert, like I already have to step away a little bit during the day. So I don't need the naps, but it was gorgeous. I remember pulling up. I felt like I was pulling up to Richie Rich's house, like from the, the movie. But I wanted to hit on the sessions. I felt like given Tech and Learning's focus on trying to recreate that community aspect of EdNet, they did a really good job of compartmentalizing or like creating tracks for sessions. And so I really appreciated that. I actually wanted to attend more than one session at every time period. When in the past, while I'm not knocking any of those conferences, I more often than not was trying to set meetings for myself, meetings for my clients, that kind of stuff during those sessions. Did you have one or two, sessions or some takeaways that you felt were really good from sessions you attended?
Yeah, I thought the sessions for me were a really great mix of opportunities to learn about how to share stories about customer success, or how to tell what's going well, whether it's from a marketing standpoint or to help other districts do similar kinds of initiatives and be successful with the need you can serve. Also, how to actually communicate with customers, right? I attended a great session with really understanding what's going on in the mind of administrators, especially today, and how to really be respectful of that, how to be a supporter and kind of confidant almost to those administrators who are going through so much right now. And then another session I attended was about what are some of the mistakes and kind of pitfalls that EdTech execs kind of fall into. Maybe you were at this same session. It was a really nice kind of candid look at a couple kind of reality checks for what it's like to actually work in the high growth EdTech space. So it was a nice balance of all these different angles that we need as EdTech leaders to grow our businesses. But at the same time, there were great opportunities to be able to have those one-on-one conversations and space and air to be able to do that.
I love that. And I'm going to give you a nice segue into talking about your session. I felt like sometimes the sessions I was going to, it's almost like they planned them that they were building off each other. And, I presented there and I presented with a couple of former educators. They probably call themselves current educators still. But in any case, we talked about how important relationship is and, those kinds of things. But I think a common theme in that panel, as well as others, was that these are people and we need to remember that, and that, they're just like you and I and anyone else listening to this podcast. They have the same issues in their personal lives, issues at work, office politics, all of those stressors that we have in our lives. And so we have to remember to take that into account and, maybe address that human first, other than trying to sell to that human. But I found a lot of value in your session. You and Alison presented on some really unique things, and I've actually already implemented a couple of things from your session. I'm going to give Alison a shout out here. I'm working on adding more meetings to my calendar right now, which is contrary to everything I believe. But she just light bulb moment me in that session of if I can do more meetings uphill, I can have less meetings or less friction downhill. So in any case, I'll hand you the mic to give some of the high points of your session, Collin. It was a really good one.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jacob. It was so great to have you there in the room. I presented with one of my former colleagues and an advisory board member for the EdTech Leadership Collective, Alison Deutsch. She's VP of Curriculum Assessment and Data at Lexia Learning. And she and I both saw that organization through some pretty dramatic growth changes from startup to mid-market to now enterprise company. And our session that we presented on was around how, as companies grow, the needs really shift, and these kind of, we call hidden hurdles of EdTech growth start to creep up. And whether you're growing from a founding team to that first management group, or whether you're a larger organization adding those next layers of kind of managers, there's things that really start to break down. So as you grow, communication needs to look a lot differently and lean on your middle managers versus being top down. And decision making needs to become more distributed across organizations. So how do we empower folks to make decisions and really carry the business forward? We also talked a bit about how strategic alignment is really important for distributed decision making, and process, systems, and fundamentals. Those all become more integrated, because without these things in place, when these hidden hurdles start to creep up, what you find is decision making becomes really slow, right? And you spend so much time in one-on-one meetings versus actually leading the business forward as a leader. And what you often find also is that your teams actually don't gain traction they need to move the business forward. So you're adding more people to an organization, but it seems like business moves more slowly. And that's a sign that these hidden hurdles that we talked about are starting to creep up. And you need to think a little bit different about how you lead, how you organize your company.
I love how you talked through that. I think the listeners here know that, or maybe I've shared, I'm also a closet history nerd. At one point, I thought I wanted to be a history teacher. And I'm listening to an Age of Napoleon podcast right now. It's super dry, but if you're a history nerd, it's a good one. Check it out. But yesterday, the episode I listened to, they basically talked about the Prussian force. They lost to Napoleon. They had superior forces, superior everything. But the way they treated their officer corps are as order takers. They were not involved in planning and strategy or anything. And so they literally lost the war and their independence because they didn't empower that middle level of leadership. It's wild, the scale that this can happen at. It can be one leadership member and one team that you're talking about, or tens of thousands of troops that, literally the entire thing was lost because they failed to empower that level of leadership. So, as a small company, I have 15 employees. I feel these pains as well. And the way that I've had to look at this is, how do I continue putting myself in a position that I'm working on the business versus for the business? I think maybe that applies the same to what you're talking about for any level of leadership, is how do you start working for that or start working on that instead of for that, whether it's a team, it's a department, it's hiring new employees, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I love that analogy about those middle leaders in an organization. And it's funny. That's one of the things that I often preach to my team members, is really kind of separating their mind, time to work in the business and work on the business. Don't just be caught in the day-to-day, but take time to step back and have those conversations with your middle level leaders to actually work on strategically leading the business forward. But what we find, we did a research study last year to ask EdTech leaders about a number of things around leadership and middle management. And we found most companies aren't actually investing the time in supporting and training up those middle level leaders, those non-exec leaders. I think about 15% said they actually feel they're doing enough to support these middle level leaders. But at the same time, only 18% felt like they could actually hire from within when they have vacancies on their team. So it's kind of this cycle that we don't seem to be at. And that's what the EdTech Leadership Collective is focused on, really providing that support, peer support, and executive coaching to develop those middle level leaders to help carry the business forward.
And I appreciate you sharing a little more detail on what you all do at the EdTech Leadership Collective. Folks, if you're listening, please don't hold Collin to those numbers exactly. He may have been off a little bit, but we will link to that report that he's quoting, so you will get exact numbers just in case. There's also a link to a webinar that he's hosting soon. Check that out. The link is going to be in the show notes, everybody. I show up and he'll dive into, some of this stuff and more. It's interesting as you're talking, I think about, my own what I'm trying to do, and all of those kinds of things. And as I've continued to make the shift, and this has taken years, as a founder, as having to play different roles, of recognizing when that role is no longer relevant or is no longer playing, making the impact it once did. When I'm starting to try to shift that, how little I've empowered some of my team members, and I have to slow down to empower them. Otherwise, all I'm doing is just changing the way I'm going about the same thing. It's still me. It's still dependent on me. It's all of that kind of stuff. It's just somebody else helping me shuffle the cards. So I think, you mentioned companies not taking the time. I think sometimes it's hard to see the issue that you're highlighting, and it's difficult to identify that might be the or a root cause. And so maybe you could end this with recommendations of how can companies or leadership members take a step back and assess whether this is happening, or whether they need to be taking a harder look at what they're providing, so that maybe they can answer those questions you quoted earlier a little bit more favorably.
Yeah, I think whether we're leading a small organization or leading a department within a larger org, we're all entrepreneurs. And these kinds of changes don't come naturally. And it's not until you start to see some of these hidden hurdles creep up that you might step back and say, gosh, I really need to kind of pull things apart a bit more. And it's some of those things like seeing decision-making becoming really slow, and you're adding more people, but you're actually not gaining traction, or the communication and values alignment is really starting to erode. So we're going to unpack all of these early next month when we do the webinar around the 4 hidden hurdles. So a little plug to join us for that, and we can dive in depth and really walk folks through how to spot these and how to really conquer those obstacles.
I love it. Love it. Reminder again for listeners, the link to that webinar will be in the show notes. And so, one last thing I think just is relevant that I've learned through some of the work I'm trying to do is I've let go of trying to make things, go my way and do things my way, and communicated more to the team where we need to land and what my vision is for that landing pad, and letting them figure it out and pull in the resources, me included if needed, to chart that course. It's been really difficult for me to let go of that, because I know my way works, but I've also learned that my way works for me. It doesn't work for the village. It doesn't work for the team. And so I've learned that the hard way many times over. My team can probably attest to that, but that was one of the hardest things for me. And so, I really appreciate the time and the insights, Collin, and the work you're doing. I look forward to the webinar. I'll be there and probably, ask you some difficult questions. But I just appreciate the work you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate it.
Awesome.